Devon's lifestyle approach to arm wrestling is very interesting and seems to be proving effective. He has changed his riser lift and even talked about how and why. His pronation lift remains much the same as it has always been, except for the fact that he used to do it from various positions, like sometimes seated, sometimes standing. In recent years it's been from a deep squat position with the same arm angle. Even if it's not, it still makes you stronger. Nobody jumps all over Devon for doing cheek curls and claiming the weight is curling Devon for 6. This lift is supposed to imitate a certain position on the table. This angle in the frame is going to be one of the positions Devon will have to defend as Devon rolls across the entire table. If you can picture an arm wrestling elbow pad underneath his arm in this frame, would that not be an appropriate defense position? In King's move, you only maintain hand control because you are in a fully supinated position, pushing your ligaments and tendons into your opponent's hand because your hand could literally not be turned over anymore. In my opinion, if you lose all elbow flexion and lose your hand completely to the point where you have to rotate your whole body and rely completely on your frame, then you have lost. Anything other than that is coping. It's angles. Elbow flexion is stronger in a more open position. Devon had incredible elbow arm strength before surgery, but he has never been able to regain that same arm strength. However, he developed an amazing hand with one of the best pronation in the world to compensate. Now his arm elbow is the limiting factor. It's important to train this lift specifically, not because you're using it for your top roll, but because you need it to hold out statically against someone's cupping ability. Erms didn't think it was important until Devon dismantled him, moving him away from his elbow flexion and back pressure strengths with stronger rise and pronation. Elbow flexion and your lats for dragging are bigger muscles, but if you never get a chance to engage those muscle groups, you're boned. It isn't as simple as Devon's pronation more than Erm's elbow flexion. Elbow flexion is likely the majority of your top roll force. Arm wrestling isn't a sport where you can avoid training certain muscles or disregard other muscle groups. You can do that, but you better make your A game extremely good. Otherwise, it's usually the more versatile pullers that get ahead. Obviously, pull how you like to pull and focus on the style you're good at, but you should train and condition everything. 100% train your pronation, regardless of whether you think it's important or not. There are 3 muscles creating active pronation force: brachioradialis indirect pronation, because of its skewed insertion, pronator quadratus, and pronator teres. The smallest of those is pronator quadratus. Our body is capable of firing multiple muscles at near maximal force output simultaneously. There's a reason why we can bench press significantly more than we can do skull crushers. Devon once shared a medical article about him when he had to have surgery on both elbows. Hardcore arm wrestling training causes the bones in your elbow to grow in size. In turn, this causes those bones to grind against each other when you flex or extend your elbow. Because of that grinding, small fragments of bone break from the elbow and end up floating inside the joint, damaging the tendons and connective tissue. When Devon had surgery, he had 1 cup of those bone fragments removed from each elbow, 2 cups in total. Devon forces the match to be about hand and wrist. His pronation strength limits the opponent's arm by cracking their wrist. It's about pronation versus pronation, where Devon is unmatched. He had enough arm power to stop Devon in the center. His arm strength was just enough to support his pronation for a specific period of time. Devon opened Devon's arm forcefully because he defeated Devon in his own weapon pronation. When Devon's arm gets straightened, the muscles are flexing in negative motion, which is physiologically stronger than positive motion. The defender is in negative motion, while the attacker is in positive motion. The closer you bring the arm to the pin pad, the more difficult it becomes to move. Strong biceps and brachioradialis are all that's needed for a King's move. The pronation comes from the shoulder, so your hand is actually supinated. You're just twisting your whole arm. The main problem is if your ligaments in your hand aren't strong enough, you can injure your hand seriously because you rely on those ligaments to hold while you're twisting into your opponent's hand. It's a weird position where your wrist is cracked back and your thumb takes the whole pressure, leaving your opponent overpronated with immense pressure on his pinky. The brachioradialis muscle is primarily responsible for keeping pronation in the Devon lift or any kind of pronated back pressure lift. One of the main functions of the brachioradialis is to pronate the wrist from a palm up to a neutral position. The actual pronator muscle is predominantly used when you're going sideways and trying to maintain pronation. That's when it really activates and where it is most relevant. Pronation is an anatomical movement, not just a pronator teres muscle lift. Pronation is a movement facilitated by different muscles in different positions. When applying neutral back pressure, it's the brachioradialis that is primarily responsible for anatomical pronation of the wrist. So you're training pronation, just not the pronator teres or quadratus muscles. Pronator teres has two heads, one connecting to the common flexor tendon and the other going to the humerus just above the elbow joint. Even though it's small, it does perform flexion because, by definition, it's a muscle that travels past a joint. Cupping doesn't fight pronation alone, it's pronation and back pressure that makes it a more even fight. If you're practicing at the table and try to keep your pronation with no back pressure, you'll lose your pronation easily. Along with other answers, back pressure with pronation also directly targets your fingers, which are considerably weaker than wrist flexion. To maximize safety and power, you must first learn to retrain these muscle groups to work differently, together. If we study the muscles, we must emphasize agonist and antagonist sets and how to retrain them. This stabilization mechanism is also important for unexpected loads imposed on the joint, allowing the muscles to quickly coactivate and provide stability to the joint, providing a higher level of safety. Muscle coactivation occurs when agonist and antagonist muscles or synergist muscles surrounding a joint contract simultaneously to provide joint stability. It is also known as muscle co-contraction since two muscle groups are contracting at the same time. This literally provides a torque dampening effect to your elbow from the opponent's force. It provides joint stabilization. Simply, you don't want your elbow joint to be opened by the opponent's force. Muscle coactivation allows muscle groups surrounding a joint to become more stable. This is due to both muscles or sets of muscles contracting simultaneously, which produces compression on the joint. The joint becomes stiffer and more stable due to this action. Isn't this the goal of arm wrestlers? For example, when the biceps and triceps coactivate, the elbow becomes more stable. Levers are rigid, and the transfer of power is lowered when the lever flexes or bends. We can see that coactivation helps to minimize power loss. With proper technique, you can use both triceps and biceps for maximum power simultaneously, but this requires retraining your muscle groups. Arm wrestling is sustained endurance at maximum output. Normal gym routines can never replace table time. This is not normal in other sports, with the exception of throwing sports like Major League Baseball pitchers. You must not only retrain your muscles to work at the same time, but arm wrestling also requires you to train to do this at maximum effort for the entire duration of a match. This is why everyone says only real table time can prepare you to compete.